This is a Sikha from Likud Sikhas, Chelek Yotes, Parshas Vaeschanan, Sikha Aleph. And the topic of the Sikha is that in this week's Parsha, we learn about the mitzvah of learning and teaching Torah, and we learn it from the pasuk of Vaeschanan levanecha. And there are 4 parts in the Sikha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 2 questions on this. Number 2, explain a difference between Torah and mitzvahs. Number 3, based on this, answer the questions. And number 4, show where we see this in the Pirkei Avos of this week. In the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, there are in general 2 tzivuyim. One tzivui is lilmod, which refers to the chiyuv to learn Torah, and one tzivui is lelamed, which refers to the chiyuv to teach Torah to others, and especially the chiyuv of a father to teach his son. And we find something very perplexing in this matter, and that is that both the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe, they don't begin their Hilchos Talmud Torah with the din that one is mechuyev to learn Torah themselves, but rather they begin Hilchos Talmud Torah with the din that there is a chiyuv and a mitzvah saseh in the Torah on a father to teach his young son Torah. So it begins with the tzivui of lelamed, and only afterwards do they teach about the tzivui of lilmed. And l'chera, it's not understood. First, that you teach the general chiyuv to learn Torah in the first place, and only afterwards that you teach that it's not enough to just learn, but rather one must also teach their young son. And as it's understood simply that there's a chiyuv to teach one's young son Torah, why is there a chiyuv for a person to teach others, and especially their young son Torah? The reason there is this chiyuv is because there's a chiyuv for one to learn Torah in general, and the Torah tells us that not only should a person themselves do this mitzvah of learning Torah, they should also teach others Torah. And this is an additional tzivah in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah that's not found in all other mitzvahs, where in all other mitzvahs, the chinuch of others, or of a father being mechanech his son, is only midrabanan. And this idea that first that you teach the tzivah to learn Torah, and only afterwards the tzivah to teach others Torah, is especially since it's not possible to have the lelamed to teach others until you first have lilmed, that you learn yourself. So lilmed should come before lelamed, both conceptually and practically. Conceptually, first there is the mitzvah of learning Torah, and by Talmud Torah there's an additional tzivui, which is to teach others this Torah, that a person should teach their young son Torah. So that's conceptually. And also practically, a person cannot do the mitzvah of lelamed, of teaching others, until they first do the limud that they learn for themselves. And so it would seem appropriate that first the Rambam and Alter Rebbe should teach about the tzivui of lilmud, that a person themselves has to learn Torah, and only afterwards about the tzivui of lelamed, that a person also has to teach others, and especially their young son, Torah. So simply we can explain that it's done in this order for 2 reasons. Number 1, since it's a mitzvah to teach a young child Torah, so learning as a child is what comes first to each person. If we look at a person's life who learns and teaches Torah, what happened for them first? First, somebody taught them Torah. So first there was the experience of lelamed by someone else teaching them Torah, and then there was the experience of lilmud that they learned themselves. So lelamed technically comes first, not in terms of a person having to learn themselves before teaching others, but in terms of what happens to a person from when they're born. First, the person is taught Torah, so first there is the experience of lelamed by someone else teaching them, and then there is the lilmud that they learn for themselves. And number 2, the tzivui, which is counted as the mitzvah. What's the tzivui? The Torah talks and speaks many times and tells us many times about the mitzvah of learning Torah. But the tzivui, which is counted as the mitzvah, which one is the actual tzivui in the Torah, is where it says Vaeschanan levanecha, which includes lilmed and lelamed, as Chazal explain. And when we look at the words Vaeschanan levanecha, they simply mean lelamed. They mean to teach. Vaeschanan levanecha, you should teach your sons, you should teach your students. Banacha elo talmidim. And so since the tzivui, which teaches us about the mitzvah of learning and teaching, is written in the form of teaching, so therefore that's the first thing that's mentioned by the Rambam and the Alter Rebbe, the mitzvah to teach, and only afterwards the mitzvah to learn. So simply we could use these 2 reasons to explain why Lilame, teaching others, is taught before Lilme, the mitzvah that a person should learn themselves. However, this itself requires an explanation. This itself needs to be understood. Why indeed is the mitzvah of Talmud Torah distinct from all other mitzvahs in these two regards? That number one, it's even for a young child, like the first point that we made, and therefore that's why this first experience of Lalami that a person is taught, and only afterwards Lilmud that a person learns. Why indeed is that unique to Talmud Torah? And number two, the second point that we made, why is it that the chiyuv of Lilmud, why does the Torah include it in the tzivui of Lalamid? Why indeed does the Torah do it this way? Now, l'cha'era, we can answer that the reason we have this distinction by Talmud Torah, that it's even for a young child, and the chiyuv of Lilmud is included in the tzivui of Lalamid, so we can answer that it's in order to express the difference between learning Torah in Elam Hazeh and the learning Torah in Elam Haba. Like it's understood that you can't compare the learning Torah here in Elam Hazeh to when Mashiach comes, when you pnuyim b'Torah v'chachmasa, like the Rambam writes, and you Yisrael chachamim g'delim, and molar tzdeya, and tarba hadeya v'chachma v'emes. So obviously the learning is going to be on an entirely higher level. And like Chazal indeed tell us that the Torah that we learn today is hevel compared to the Torah that we're going to learn when Mashiach comes. And so it comes out that the general learning Torah today here in Elam Hazeh, even from those who are g'delim, that are adults, it's really not any more than the learning of a katan. And in addition, just like the learning Torah of a child, of a katan, is the idea of chinuch, you are educating the child, which basically what that means is that it prepares the child for when they get the main chiyuv, their main obligation. They themselves, when they become a gadol, have to learn. So the same is true regarding learning Torah in general in Elam Hazeh, that the current learning Torah is a chinuch and a preparation to learning Torah when Mashiach comes. And like we find, it's explained that only when there is Talmud b'yadai, which means that a person does what they need to do down here in this world, then in Gan Eden do they have a learning Torah in the proper way. And so certainly that also applies to the learning Torah when Mashiach comes, that only if a person learns here, will they have it then. And so it's the idea, and it's similar to the idea of chinuch and preparation for later. So that's why we find something unique, this unique thing in Torah, that you have this thing of chinuch, because our entire learning of Torah fits into that idea of chinuch. And so that's why there is the chinuch of a katan, and that's why that's where the limit is learned from, because really that's our entire learning. It's a form of chinuch. However, this explanation is not enough, since we find this very same idea by mitzvahs. Also, the mitzvahs that we do today, it says that they are in a level of katnus compared to the mitzvahs that we'll do when Mashiach comes, where then we will do the mitzvahs k'mitzvahs ritzenecha, the way Hashem really wants. And so the mitzvahs today are also on a level of katnus, and they're also a form of chinuch for the mitzvahs of Olam Haba. And so we can't really answer the question of how Torah is distinct, or why Torah is distinct, and that it also has chinuch, and we learn the whole mitzvah to learn Torah from the mitzvah of teaching Torah. We can't explain that it's because of the unique quality of Torah, that it's in a form of katnus compared to the Torah of Elam Haba, because we find the very same thing by mitzvahs as well. And nevertheless, by mitzvahs, we don't have chinuch min Torah, and we don't learn the mitzvah of doing mitzvahs from the mitzvah of chinuch, of children to do mitzvahs. So we will understand this by first explaining the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. So now we're going to go to a side discussion, explain the difference between Torah and mitzvahs, and based on that, we're going to answer our questions. So the difference, or one of the differences between Torah and mitzvahs, is that mitzvahs, the main inyan of mitzvahs, which are done with physical objects, is to make an impact on the world, which means to be mevar and mezakech, the physical object, and the keiches of the nefesh habahamis, which a person uses to fulfill the mitzvah. And therefore, even though a person must fulfill mitzvahs with bittul, and not because it makes sense, but rather because it's the Ratzon Elyon, that's what Hashem wants. And as we say by the mitzvahs, Asher Kedishanu b'mitzvahs of Vitzivanu, we do them because Hashem commanded us. But nevertheless, the main thing is the doing of the mitzvah. The bittul and the letzaref be'emes habriyos, the other benefits are like extra things. What the mitzvah has to bring forth in the person, that a person should feel batul, and that it should be mitzaref habriyos, it isn't ma'akev b'di'evid. And it's like an extra thing to the actual doing of the mitzvah. The main thing is the physical doing of the mitzvah, because the purpose of the mitzvahs is to be mevar and mezakech, the physical world. Torah, on the other hand, the inyan of learning Torah, the gather of learning Torah, is that the person's seichel should understand and unite with the muskal. That's the definition of learning Torah, that a person's seichel understands and becomes completely one with the muskal, meaning that a person should seek the truth of the haskalah, not the understanding and the conclusions that they want to have, but rather what the haskalah really is, which by Torah, what is the haskalah of Torah? It's chachmasei yisbarach. So therefore, because of this, because the whole idea of Torah is that a person's seichel understands and unites with the muskal. And what is the muskal of Torah? It's chachmasei yisbarach. So therefore, the inyan of bittul is a fundamental part of learning Torah. It's not an extra thing, because since Torah is chachmasei yisbarach, and chachmasei yisbarach, Hashem's chachma is completely higher than Gedar Nivraim, so it can't be grasped by a nivra. A nivra cannot grasp something that's entirely higher than Gedar Nivraim. But that's the whole definition of Torah, that a person should grasp, understand, and unite with the Torah, which is higher than Gedar Nivraim. So the only way for that to be done is if one learns with bittul. When one learns with the koyach of their seichel, not with bittul, so then not only they're not uniting with the Chochmah of Hashem, but it can lead, as a result of the fact that they're not really uniting with the Chochmah of Hashem, it can lead to Megala Panam B'Torah Shalei Kalacha, literally to come to a conclusion that's the opposite of Torah. It's Chochmah what they'll come up with, it's good, they'll come up with good svaras, good ideas, but it's not a halacha of Torah. And therefore, this is the reason why it has to be Bercho B'Torah Tchila. The reason why you have to have the bracha on Torah beforehand, when the bracha emphasizes that it's Hashem's Torah. We say Neis and Torah is in order to have as a yesod, a foundation to learning Torah, a person has to have the bittul. And if a person has the bittul, then they can be a kli for the Torah, which is Chochmasei Yisbarach. Now, just like there must be bittul as a foundation and an introduction to learning Torah, which, as we said, that makes a person a kli to Hashem's Torah, so too there must be bittul during the time of learning Torah, more so than during the time of doing mitzvahs. Because by mitzvahs, when a person does a mitzvah properly, which what does it mean to do a mitzvah properly? Because that's what Hashem commanded. So when a person is doing a mitzvah properly, one's mitzias isn't mixed into it. The definition of a mitzvah is that a person is doing what Hashem commanded, which means that their mitzias isn't mixed into it already. And so therefore, there is not such a need to be concerned that the Aveda should be with bittul, because the whole Aveda itself has this ingredient of bittul. However, by Torah, since the whole inyan of Torah is the unity of the person's seichel with the muskal, which, as we said, is Hashem's chachma, meaning what we're saying is that a person comes to Hashem's chachma with their own seichel. That's what limit Torah is. So therefore, it's necessary to make sure one's mitzias doesn't get mixed in, because if a person's mitzias gets mixed in, like we said, then a person cannot come to the truth. And when a person, for an example, a person may sometimes think that the only thing that matters to them is the truth of Torah, and that's why they think they are having a strong feelings and a strong reaction to what somebody else says, which they think is incorrect, when in truth, the main thing that's bothering them is not because they're feeling the truth of Torah. The main thing that's bothering them and the main thing that they feel is that it doesn't fit with their seichel. And so by Torah, it's especially important to have bittul not just as an introduction and a preparation and a foundation, but also during the learning of Torah, a person also has to be aware of the necessity to have bittul, since the whole definition of the learning is that a person is using their seichel to come to Hashem's chachma, and that's only possible when there's this bittul of the person. According to this, we can explain the above two inyanim. Number one, that the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is also to teach a child, unlike by other mitzvahs. We don't have the inyan of chinuch min Torah. And number two, that the mitzvah of learning of an adult, the mitzvah of lilmaid, is included in the tzivay of Vaeschanan levanecha, which simply means lalamid, to teach one's son. Because this expresses the two inyanim of bittul that we said are so fundamental and necessary for the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The idea that learning Torah begins by a child, and even similarly before that midarabanan, from when a child can speak, this emphasizes that the beginning and foundation of learning Torah is not the seichel in Torah, but rather the bittul. Like we said, there first has to be the beruchu b'Torah, the bittul to the nesan Torah. And this inyan of bittul is not dependent on greatness and seichel, but rather it exists by every yid, even a child, because of their neshama. And so, by having the mitzvah of chinuch by Talmud Torah, it's telling us that the main thing by Torah is what we see by even a child has. A child doesn't have greatness, doesn't have a lot of seichel, but what they have, just like any adult has, because they have a neshama, is the bittul. And the second detail that we said, that also the mitzvah of learning of an adult is included in the tzivay Vaeschanan levanecha, so that teaches us that also during the learning itself, when one is engaged with the Torah, with their seichel, they're doing the mitzvah of lilmaid. So one must have the bittul like that of a child. So by the Torah telling us that Talmud Torah has chinuch, it's telling us that the main thing before learning is the bittul. And by the Torah teaching the mitzvah of lilmaid, with the words Vaeschanan levanecha, which mean to teach a young child, it's telling us that also when a person is doing the action, the mitzvah of learning, they're not as a preparation to learning, they're actually learning, also then they have to have the bittul like that of a child. So with this, we answered all of our questions, and now we're going to move on to the second part of the Sikha. So as we spoke many times, since every inyan, and especially in Torah, is b'hashgacha pratis and is precise, everything in general in the world is b'hashgacha pratis, and especially in Torah, so it's understood that there's a meaningful connection between the Parshas Shavua and the Perek in Pirkei Avos, which we learn on that Shabbos. Because since everything is exact, everything is precise, everything is b'hashgacha pratis, so if on this Shabbos we read this Parsha and learn this Perek in Pirkei Avos, that means there's a connection between the two of them. And bringing it to our inyan, since there are varying opinions whether we say Pirkei Avos on the Shabbos of Tisha B'Av, this Sikha was connected to the Shabbos of Tisha B'Av, or it was Erev Tisha B'Av, the year that it was said and the year that it was given out. And some opinions say that on such a Shabbos we do say Pirkei Avos, others say we don't. But since there are opinions that say that we do, and Elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim, they're both part of Torah, so we'll explain it according to the opinion that we do say Pirkei Avos, and so the Perek would be Perek Revi. And we're going to go with this opinion, especially since Achakale b'chol yom sheyaveh, and we're waiting for Mashiach to come, and that these days of mourning will be transformed to days of Yamim Tovim. So this includes waiting with a great yearning that we will say Pirkei Avos according to all opinions. And so in addition to the general connection between Parshas Vaeschanan and Perek Revi of Pirkei Avos, which is that in both of them we find many inyanim related to learning Torah, so in addition to that we also find in two Mishnayos in Perek Revi a hayra and an emphasis regarding the two inyanim of bittul that are required by Talmud Torah. So we're going to discuss over here two Mishnayos. First Mishnah Chaf and then Mishnah Yutes. Mishnah Chaf says, "Halei meteri yeled l'mahu daimeh l'dyei ksuva al nir chodesh." Someone who teaches Torah to a child, what are they similar to? They're similar to writing with ink on a fresh new piece of paper, where the words and the letters come out very clear. V'halei zaken l'mahu daimeh l'dyei ksuva al nir machik. And someone who teaches Torah to an older person, what is that similar to? To writing with ink on an old, worn-out paper where the words and the letters aren't clear. And so the Rebbe asks over here, the Hira in the first section, that Halei meteri yeled, the Hira over there is understood. It encourages a yid about the importance of learning Torah while still young, and not to push it off until one is old. So we already have over here the encouragement to start while young, which means that a person shouldn't wait until they're old. However, why does the Mishnah need to emphasize the warning in the second section that va'aloimet zakin. Why does the Mishnah have to emphasize it? It already tells us aloimet Torah yeled. The emphasis sounds is like the Mishnah is coming to teach that someone who didn't learn Torah until they were older, they should despair from succeeding in learning Torah. Is that what the Mishnah is coming to teach us? That if a person didn't learn Torah until they were older, so they should despair from succeeding in learning Torah? And the explanation is, according to what we learned about the bittul that's needed for learning Torah, so aloimet Torah yeled also means that one learns Torah with bittul, which only then is the Torah absorbed in a person, like the ink on a new fresh piece of paper. However, when one learns Torah only with their seichel, which that's the idea of a zakin. Who's a zakin? Zeh shekana chachma. So when a person learns Torah with their seichel without bittul, then the Torah, which is Hashem's Torah, cannot be properly absorbed by a person. Because like we said, the Torah is Hashem's Torah, which is completely higher than the whole Geder of Nevrayim. And so the message in the Mishnah is very much telling us not only that a person has to have bittul, but also telling us that if a person doesn't have bittul, then it won't be absorbed. It'll be like putting ink on a worn out piece of paper. The Torah won't be absorbed. The person has to have bittul. So it's not referring to someone who's old and they can't undo their situation. It's referring to someone who's just a zakin, zeh shekana chachma. There's no bittul. And the Mishnah, the Tana, is telling us that absolutely a person has to know and therefore make a change. A person has to know that if a person learns Torah from such a place, then they can't properly absorb the Torah. Now in Mishnah Yotes it says, Shmuel HaKatan Eimer, Shmuel HaKatan says, and this is a pasuk from Mishlei, Bin poilei vecha al tismach, when your enemy falls, don't be happy, uvekoshlei, and when he stumbles, al yogel libecha, your heart shouldn't rejoice. Pen yira Hashem, lest Hashem see, v'rabe inov, and it'll be evil, it'll be bad in his eyes, v'heishiv me olav apay, and Hashem will take his anger from your fellow and place it on this person. And so over here, there's a well-known question, which is, what's the chiddush of Shmuel HaKatan? What is he teaching us here? This is a clear pasuk in Mishlei. So what is exactly this teaching of Shmuel HaKatan? So the Machzor Vitri explains that the pasuk refers to a war in worldly matters, and Shmuel HaKatan adds that also by Milchamta Shel Torah, a war of Torah between two Talmidei Chachamim, and one wins over the other, so the victor has to know that Bin Poilei Vecha Al Tismach. And this is similar to the tefillah of Rabbi Nechunyo ben Akone. He used to say before going into the Beis HaMedrash, he said, "V'lo yikoshlu chaverei b'dvar halacha v'esmach behem." My friends in the Beis HaMedrash shouldn't make a mistake in their learning of halacha, and then I will be happy about it. He was davening to Hashem that shouldn't happen. So also here, Shmuel HaKatan is instructing that a person should not be happy when they win the war. Now, in what way is a war of Torah different than a worldly war, that therefore we would think that there could be ben poilei vecha tismach? Shmuel HaKatan is telling us that it's not just in a worldly matters, in a war of worldly matters, that a person shouldn't be happy ben poilei vecha. It's also by Milchamta Shel Torah, which means if not for his teaching, we would think that by Milchamta Shel Torah, then we'd say ben poilei vecha tismach. So the question is, why would we think this? So the explanation is that since the person was victorious over their fellow in a matter of halacha, so it's not their personal victory, but rather the victory of Torah, which will bring a great simcha. So ben poilei vecha, there should be tismach. The truth of the Torah was revealed. And Shmuel HaKatan comes and says, bin poilei vecha al tismach. Why not? Because if the person only cared about the truth of Torah, so then it wouldn't be felt in their simcha that it's been poilei vecha. It wouldn't be been poilei vecha tismach. It would be that the Torah is revealed, the truth of the halacha is revealed, so tismach. If a person is experiencing it been poilei vecha, so then al tismach. Because if they only cared about the truth of Torah, they wouldn't feel the ben poilei vecha aspect. They'd only feel the positive, that a matter in Torah has become clear. Another inyan in this, if the person was truly committed to reveal Hashem's chachma, and that's what they're experiencing, and it's the simcha of coming to halacha, so then they wouldn't need to think even. Not only wouldn't they feel that it's been poilei vecha, they wouldn't even understand it and see it and think of it as been poilei vecha, since we're talking about an opinion in Torah, an elu ve'elu, divrei l'kim chayim. Yes, in halacha we could only go with one opinion, but both opinions are part of Torah. And therefore, since the person feels a simcha from bin pei levecha, so the person sees it as bin pei levecha, and their feeling is a joy from bin pei levecha. So Shmuel Katan means that he was maktan himself. The Indian of bittul. He teaches that learning Torah has to be with bittul, and the person should only care about reaching the truth of Torah. So again, over here we see the message of bittul connected to the actual learning of Torah. We're going to continue here and bring out another point in order to explain the second half of the pasuk, where it says, "Uvekoshle al yogel libecha," that when your fellow stumbles, your heart shouldn't rejoice. Panir Hashem, lest Hashem see v'Rabbi Einov, it'll be evil in his eyes. V'heishiv me'olav apa, you'll take from upon him his anger and place it on this person. So we continue and say that, however, one can claim it's true that also the opinion of Eivecha can be correct, since, as we said, Elu ve'elu divrei l'kim chayim. However, the other person didn't just want to say an opinion in Torah. The other person wanted to say it as the opinion which is the halacha. So therefore, since the other person is wrong about it being halacha, so this is an instance of bin poel Eivecha. It is bin poel, because in terms of it being halacha, it's not halacha. So why do we demand al tismach and not to feel that it's bin poel Eivecha? So therefore, Shmuel HaKatan continues, Pen yira Hashem v'Rabbi Einov v'heishiv me'olav apay. It's possible that the reason the other person didn't come to the correct halacha isn't because of something that they're lacking, but rather as a punishment, because of apay. And therefore, a person shouldn't feel simcha that the other person, and it's through this person that won the war of halacha, a person shouldn't feel happy that this other person, and through them, received the punishment. The simcha should only be that the halacha was clarified, like we brought up earlier, that even if it is a Eivecha, what the person should feel is not the ben poel Eivecha. They should feel that the truth of the Torah came out. And to the contrary, not only shouldn't the person feel ben poel Eivecha, if the person feels simcha from ben poel Eivecha, then Hashem may place apay on this person themselves. And through thinking deeply into this, a person will succeed in not only feeling, and not only not feeling that it's ben poel Eivecha, but rather the opposite. It'll be the opposite of ben poel Eivecha. It'll be the greatest of closeness. It'll be einam zazim misham at shenasim oyevim zeh zeh, like Chazal say. They won't move from there until they love one another. And even more so, as it's said about the Vaeschanan and Beis Hillel, that chiba v'reus noegim zeh b'zeh. They actually had closeness and friendship and love among one another. L'kayim hashenemar, to fulfill what's said in the pasuk, ha'emes v'hasholim ehavu.